Welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us for a great episode of the Duchenne Live, presented by family, friends, and Duchenne, with your hosts Dr. Ryan Russell and myself, DJ Kimball. We have a great show tonight. We have two wonderful guests joining us tonight, Matthew Bush, an adult with Duchenne, who will share his experience with suicidal ideation. Our second guest is Dr. Natalie Truba, from Nationwide Children's Hospital, who will be discussing the tendencies of depression and thoughts of suicide among the Duchenne population and how the lack of dystrophin may play a role.
Thank you. So to start off with, Matthew, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Matthew. I am 34 years old, and I have Duchenne muscular dystrophy.
Thank you. And when did your suicidal thoughts start, and why?
When I was 15 years old, I started having suicidal thoughts because students in high school were being mean to me and picking on me. Also, a teacher was being very unfair and rude to me. I remember crying and not wanting to exist. I was always ready to go home because at home I didn't have to worry about people being rude or mean.
How did you feel during this time?
During this time, I got very depressed and decided to stop talking to people in high school. I told my mom I wanted to
have
kill
a question
myself.
for
She said
Dr.
you will need to go to the hospital for a mental check, and that snapped me out of it because I didn't want to be away from my mom.
How did you cope during this time?
I coped by playing video games, hanging out with family, and hanging out with a few friends I had. Playing with my dog and music really helped a lot. I tried counseling, but to be honest, it didn't really help.
Do you have suicidal thoughts now?
I rarely have suicidal thoughts now. Now that I'm older, I just mostly get depressed.
And how do you feel now?
I get depressed about not having my own house, not being able to take care of myself, my parents having to take care of me, not having a girlfriend or kids.
How do you cope now?
Now that I'm older, I still play video games, play with my dogs, hang out with family, and on rare occasions, I hang out with friends.
What advice do you have for parents?
The best advice I can give parents is to have conversations with your kid or adult, because just talking to someone can help.
Wow, Matthew, thank you so much for coming and sharing your experience with us. It takes an incredible amount of courage and vulnerability to share all of those things with all of Facebook and all of our Duchenne community. So thank you for helping us get this conversation started. And if there's anything else that you want to say or jump in or share throughout our conversation tonight, please do. And again, in Facebook, anybody who wants to make comments, I think, the more we talk about this, the more people speak up and share their own personal experiences, the more we can start to identify and help the people who need it in our community, because it's here. Even if people don't talk about it, it's here. Tonight, Natalie Truba, thank you for coming and chatting with us. I understand that Matthew's experience isn't isolated. Would you agree? Yeah.
Yes.
So let's start off just getting some definitions kind of squared away. Could you clarify the difference between suicide, suicidal attempt, ideation and thoughts?
Sure. Suicide usually refers to completed suicide, right? Someone commits suicide, it's an act. Suicidal ideation is sort of thinking and thoughts about not wanting to exist, not wanting to be alive, wanting to die, wanting to end your life. We can classify those into active, like I am actively thinking about killing myself and I have a plan and I'm thinking of an intent or way I'm going to do that. Or passive, kind of like I have no real thoughts. I'm not really thinking about doing it. I necessarily don't want to. I just don't really want to be alive. I don't want to deal with this. I just wish I could just disappear, right? Or kind of, just not have to deal with this. And if that meant I died, then I would be like, fine, right? And what was the third one, Lindy? Sorry.
No, good. Suicidal ideation and thoughts, suicide attempt. I think we got them.
Okay.
And then one more, and this one's always confused me because I can see it two different ways. Survivor of suicide. So is that the person who's attempted and survived, or is it the family?
That's a good question. And I think we might be talking philosophy at this point. In the psychological world, there's been a big push over the last many years to kind of move away from saying, successful suicide, successfully completed suicide, or, we tend to get away from some of that language, right? So we want to talk about what it is. Like they killed themselves, they ended their life. It wasn't successful, right? It was tragic, and there isn't anything good about that. The victim piece, I think, is tricky. It comes into that language realm, right? Of talking about somebody's a victim of mental health. I think, this is not something that we do as a choice or to get attention, or something that is just an easy thing to manage. So I think in the sense of being a victim of poor healthcare, of poor access, of, things that maybe would have helped us manage really intense mental health experiences, thoughts and feelings, things that are happening to us different, so that we could have maybe not got to a place so dark that we saw that as our only escape or way out or way of getting relief from all this pain. I would say victim in that way. I think we get dangerous when we start to think about a victim of suicide in the sense of if they survive this attempt, right? We'd say they didn't kill themselves, right? So that's a good thing. And we were able to kind of have supports and like help somebody through a really difficult time. I think anytime somebody doesn't get the care they need, they're a victim. I don't know, I'm hesitant to kind of play that into how we talk about people that kill themselves versus those who try to kill themselves and don't.
Right. Matthew shared in our chat here that he never had any plans of suicide. It was just a difficult time. That leads us beautifully into our next question. What's normal thoughts about suicide? I mean, is it normal just to passively think, oh gosh, I wish I could die? Talk to us about that, because what you shared with me the other day surprised me.
Yeah, no, I think, and how Matt talked about it, I think is a really good example of how people experience suicidal ideation. So passive suicidal ideation, or the one where you're kind of like, I'm not actively planning or wanting to kill myself. I actually don't want to kill myself. I just don't want to live like this anymore. So the passive piece is kind of like, I just am miserable and I don't want to live like this. I don't want to kill myself, but I just don't this is not a way of living life. You might actually want to kill yourself though too, right? But have no desire to actually do it or intention, but you're just I don't see another way out. I just wish I could die. Right. But just different than I am planning on going home today and I'm going to do this and this and this, and I'm going to kill myself. I'm taking my life today. Passive suicidal ideation is actually more common than most people think. It's just something most people don't talk about. People without chronic illness have passive suicidal ideation at times in life, and a lot of people experience passive suicidal ideation at least at some time in their life, right? Majority of people kind of are like, man, I'm really struggling, and and you get through it, and then you look back and you're like, man, I was not okay, right? But it never evolves to a place of active suicidality or worsening problems. Within disability communities, that is very different. Passive ideation, or sort of that desire to not have to deal with what you're dealing with, or the wish you could escape, or wish you didn't have to be here, wish you didn't exist, is actually pretty common, particularly when those chronic diseases involve things like that impact your ability to live life how you want to live, or you have pain, or it takes away opportunities to do those things that give us meaning, and things that you want in life, or that it makes it harder to do, or that other people maybe respond to you in ways that aren't necessarily fair to who you are as a person and what you're capable of, right? And so prejudice and judgment and discrimination, and the things that tend to be barriers to you being able to do the things in life that you want to do, not because you can't do them, but because the world is not designed for you to do them easily, means other people need to make accommodations. And if they don't do that, that is a particular hellish place to live. And then the elephant in the room for y'all is that there are times that you want to kill yourself and like can't, right? Like how you would want to is not an option, because you have to have the means. And so being trapped, being stuck in a position that you didn't ask for, that you don't have control for, is like a very ripe situation to find yourself feeling like, I just wish I didn't have to deal with this. I just wish I could escape. And so that passiveness that comes along with sort of navigating a really complicated medical condition that is progressive, right? So over time, and when you have totally capable and fully stilly intact neurological functioning, is understandably incredibly hard to cope with. And I actually get more nervous when people are like, oh, I'm fine, I don't have any issues, like this is great, I like love this. Like I'm like, that's weird, right? It's more normal to be like, I know it sucks and I'm not okay, right? We work through that, we develop skills, right? We don't want to be stuck there, because then that evolves into a worse place. But experiencing passive as sign of itself is not, it's likely much more common than you think. And probably if everybody actually like was honest about like, oh yeah, I've had these experiences, you'd be like, oh man, it's like a lot of us, it's like probably most of us, right? It's not good. I think we have a lot of work to do around, how do we do things better so that people aren't experiencing so much suffering. But that is definitely, I think, a shared experience in the community.
In the interest of just being courageous, I will share, I don't have Duchenne muscular dystrophy, but I have had passive suicidal ideation myself as a teen. So just in the interest of getting that conversation out there, getting it normalized, just spontaneously decided to share that with everyone. So at what point, Natalie, at what point should somebody start to become concerned about themselves or about a family member?
I think if you're experiencing passive SI, it's concerning, right? Because we're having so much suffering and pain that we wish that we weren't here. We just didn't exist. You might find yourself being one of those people. It's like, I don't want to kill myself, but if I got hit by a car, I'd be like, okay, I don't have to deal with this anymore, right? That's concerning, because that means you're in a lot of pain and you're struggling and you're suffering. And that's not an okay way to live, just because you don't want to actually like actively kill yourself. That's still not a good way to live. If that moves into active, then it's definitely time to seek, right? Because at that point, then we are kind of maybe potentially really putting ourselves in danger. One of our loved ones are. And so you want to get involved as soon as possible, right? It's always easier to stay ahead and help prevent and help proactive and help kind of do this on the front end than when we're there and digging out of a big mental health hole where we're like really struggling, and we really are having a hard time seeing how we can do different, or how we can experience relief so that we don't feel so much pain or so much burden or so heavy.
Here in the chat here in our Zoom meeting, guys, DJ shared with us that most of his thoughts about suicidal ideation begin as passive, but I have issues with resetting myself to calm down. And it just keeps building till I find myself begging for it to end with no options to actually be able to do it. And that's, as you said the other day, Natalie, that's a certain type of hell that you're living in. And again, we're not promoting suicide or self-harm or any of that, but just, to imagine you're in so much pain, it just compounds it that you can't do a stinking thing about it. Yeah.
These are one of those situations, and this is what's hard, I think. When you want to change something, you don't have control to change something, right? Like what we want to do is like, let's just get rid of Duchenne. We didn't have to deal with it, and we could just go live life and like do the things I want to do, and I would be better. And you're right, you would be. And living in that space, we're just striving to change something that we literally have no control over. And if that thing would just change, things would be better. It's going to keep that suffering going. And where the work happens in these types of situations, where a lot of the suffering is coming from things out of your control that we don't actually have a ways to fix, is on working on our reactions to that, acceptance of certain pieces, right? So if we don't have control over a situation, we don't have control over certain things, there's other places that we work around. How do we think about, how do we accept, how do we work on the next pieces? And sometimes it's the opposite of what you actually think that actually is needed to help yourself reframe and have a different lens to reprocess and to kind of help you shift away from that, right? And so if what you're doing isn't working, my guess is it's now like a pretty ingrained habit, and you're going to have to like shift out of that to do something different in order to actually get maybe a different sort of benefit to yourself. So that's a tricky one. That's where therapy comes in. And I am curious from Matt, if you would speak a little bit about what Matthew, I'm sorry, what with your therapy experiences, like reflecting back as an adult now, like what do you think was not helpful? Like what was it about that therapy experience that wasn't helpful, or that you look back and you're like, man, if this would have been different? Because I think in the experience I have with working with men with DMD and adolescents and boys is that fit comes down, and a lot of people try therapy and they're like, it didn't feel fit, I didn't like them, and then then we fall out because we're like, we tried, it was weird, I didn't like it, right? And therapy is definitely those things, like finding a good fit is important, because you're talking about stuff that's just uncomfortable sometimes, and being able to be comfortable is important when you're forcing yourself to be uncomfortable, right? So I'm just curious if you don't mind, Matthew, like speaking to that a bit.
And so Matthew replied here, maybe because I felt like they weren't disabled, so they didn't understand.
Sure, that's fair. Finding therapists who can help you feel supported, and as if the process is what's important, and not that they have to fully understand your experience, but that they understand suffering and what it feels to suffer, and that suffering can look different, and how do we manage suffering when suffering is a part of life, and how do we not get stuck in a place of suffering is important, because you're unlikely to probably find many therapists that have a disability that they get what it means and feels to live the life of somebody with DMD. I wonder if we had more of these for therapists, where they could hear the experience of like these things, if we would not do a better job on our end as psychologists and counselors and therapy providers around like, how do we help navigate an experience we can never understand, right? One, like I can, I mean, first off, I'm a woman, you're, man. Second, I don't have DMD and you do. Third, our ages are different, fourth. So like, but I understand suffering. I haven't suffered like you, I've suffered in different ways. The process by which people cope and can navigate and the skills you can develop though are very similar, right? It might be implemented different, and maybe how you think about it needs to be different, and the impact on your and your mental and your heart and your emotions might be different because we're different people. But the process by which we cope with suffering and help ourselves get through suffering and over suffering is really a universally shared experience. It just looks different, and the problem is we try to compare suffering. Like somebody might be suffering because their car didn't start this morning. You're like, oh my gosh, if that was my biggest problem, like, please, I would be like living life here. But you've seen people, I'm sure, melt down. Then you're like, oh my gosh, you're upset over that. Like, let me tell you how long it took me to put my socks on today. And so like we get into this comparative thing that can make it hard when we, and I'm including myself in your community right now, have a lot of reasons to be angry and to feel like things are unfair and that people don't get it because they don't, right? And sometimes we want to make sure we're not putting our own barriers and walls up to letting people help us.
this might be a hard one to answer. But along those lines of when to be concerned about people, how do you know when to be concerned about yourself?
I think if you start to have thoughts of not wanting to be alive or wishing you didn't exist, or that you have so much pain or suffering that like it would just be easier if you weren't here, like that's concerning. I think if you're finding yourself feeling alone or feeling as if you have less support, or if you're in pain all the time, emotional or physical, those are good times to seek support. Big things, like if you notice like, hey, I used to love doing video game with my friends and I just like don't feel like doing that thing, and I'm not getting joy out of like what I used to get joy out of, and I just don't have as much motivation, and like I'm just that's a really good time to start to get support, right? Because what happens unfortunately with depression is the things you do to cope with depression, right? Depression is not your friend. Depression does things, that tells you to do things that actually keeps you more depressed. It's like a real cyclic, fickle monster. And then you feel worse, and then your depression gets worse, and then you just get into this hole, right? And so the best thing we can do are like stay ahead of it and like make it normal in the community to like not be okay, and be like, how do we talk about that? Like imagine if like you had to hide all the struggles that come along with having a muscle weakness disease, like you would go crazy. You would be like, oh no, like we're fine, it just takes us 2 hours we just need 2 more hours to like get there because we're organizing a dinner party, when really it just like takes 2 hours to get your stuff together to get out of the house. Like you would go crazy. It's just better to be like, oh, we can't do that. It takes us too long to get our stuff together, get out of the house because we have DMD, right? But we don't do that for mental health. Like we do verbal circles and circuses to try to tell people we're okay when we're not, right? And it's okay, right? Like, so if we change the conversation, I think that would be helpful. Like, you have a hard disease to manage, right? Like it's hard on you, it's hard on your families, it's hard on anybody that cares for you, and even in the smallest way, because people want to help too and they can't. And so it's a really hard place to be, because people often say things too that can make it worse when we try to say things to make people feel better, right? Like I wish I was good enough that I could say like one thing and you'd be like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better, I don't want to kill myself anymore and this disease is fine. But like nobody's that good, right? And so it's a process, and it's hard, and the better we do of like making things normal and bringing things in and helping people learn from each other, the better off we're going to be.
You itemized there some great examples of environmental reasons why our community would be more inclined to this sort of ideation. What about just the disease itself and the dystrophin in the brain? You've given us some amazing talks about the higher rate of mental health comorbidities within the Duchenne population, and the ODD and the autism and the ADHD and the anxiety. Oh, I know the anxiety one so well. So can you talk to us a little bit more about that part of it, even if it's just speculation at this point? I know we're on the cusp of everything. Yeah,
this is all speculation at this point. No, but I think what we know about dystrophin or brain dystrophin, and from our mice models and our boys, is that dystrophin is playing a big role in how you regulate and how your brain regulates and how your brain sort of structures prenatally, and just from sort of a physiological regulation standpoint. And so if you're more vulnerable as a child to experiences that impact learning, that impact how your stress response system resides, impact how you function in school, impact the way peers perceive you, like that has trickle down secondary sequelae, as we would say, medicine effects, right? Like there's going to be secondary impact to that. And so the multifaceted, right? And a big piece of that, right, for anybody with suicidality, it's multifaceted, right? But then with DMD, you have the added challenging aspects of like how dystrophin impacts the brain, or lack of dystrophin therefore impacts the brain, and it will make you more vulnerable. It makes you more vulnerable to being impulsive, to not having as good of emotion regulation and just stress tolerance, which are really big things when it comes to suicidality and emotion sort of management and functioning. And so it increases your vulnerability to have intense internal experiences that are really hard to cope with. And that is a huge, so we look at the primary risk factors for suicidal ideation: previous suicide attempt, history of depression or other mental illness. Check out the second one, check, huge rate of depression and mental illness in this community. Serious illness such as chronic pain, check. Criminal legal problems, not usually, unless you guys are out there like committing some serious white collar crime I don't know about yet. Which if you are, power to you. Job, financial problems or financial loss, check. Impulsive or aggressive tendencies, check. Substance use, check, but not necessarily like normal substance use always, but like a lot of us are on a lot of meds for pain or for other things, and we cope in ways that aren't necessarily always healthy. That's the American culture, right? Current or prior experiences of adverse childhood events, check. Sense of hopelessness, check. Victims of violence or bullying, check, right? And that's just the individual. These aren't even the relationship, the environment, the access to care, community ones. So you are already, outside of even having DMD, well, because of DMD, have all of these instant vulnerability factors. And then if you have a brain that makes you more vulnerable to really intense emotional experiences, hard to cope with, that just kind of adds fuel to that fire, right? And so when we think about suicidal risk, we are always thinking they're in the lens of risk factors. Like, what is the risk? Do we have a low risk? Do we have a high risk? And that helps us for us know, like, oh, this is somebody that has if they're a really high risk, that means they have a lot of vulnerability factors. They don't have a lot of protective factors. And that means that they're at a higher risk. You can have a lot of vulnerability factors and a lot of protective factors, and that kind of equals out, right? But that sometimes those protective factors are less available in the community simply because of the way that DMD impacts your ability to like live in the community, right? And so it's more of like that synergistic or multifaceted effect of like how we know what's going on. Well, we don't know, but we are appreciating that there is a lot happening in the brain that makes our individuals with DMD much more vulnerable to certain things. They play out one way in childhood. They play out kind of a different way in adulthood. And in adulthood, it's in much more of that. How does it impact thinking? So just like we get perseverative stuck, sort of behavioral loops or thought loops when we're young, that can turn very dark and be very hard to manage than in the normal neurotypical population, because of the ability you all have to kind of perseverate and in that from that dystrophin lens. So like, just like you can focus on, how your socks feel for 4 hours, you can focus on a distressing thought you might have had that other people could let go easier. And that then makes you more vulnerable to having those secondary or subsequent sort of mental health experiences. So it is hard. It isn't easy at all to sometimes get those thoughts in check. And like for, something that DJ was speaking to, sometimes like being able to get out of that is really hard because of how your brains function and how hard it is to regulate. And so you're kind of stuck in that thought loop for a while, and you could just be doing that even if you don't want to, where like I can shift my attention, and if my thoughts will follow, and if that takes a bit, you can try, but it's just going to keep going. It's going to kind of take even longer. Right. And so that's a lot to sit with and to tolerate and be like, oh, cool. Okay. Made it out of that. I feel fine. Like, you're not going to feel fine after that. Like that's a horrible voice to hear, and a loud voice in your head for that long.
I'm glad you brought that up briefly, because you help give a fantastic talk about parent mental health. And I know it overlaps into other populations as well, about how the intersection of psychiatry and psychology together can be very helpful. That's another talk, another web page, another thing, but absolutely having that help with the chemical interruption, because it's not always just a behavioral thought pattern. And then to add to it, the guys are chatting here. Matt said, when I was younger, I probably felt like I could handle everything on my own without a counselor because I felt like I had to stay strong. Getting help for mental health is still in its infancy. Would you say, Natalie?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think we're doing a good job at recognizing like dystrophin in the brain is a real thing, and it's impacting behavior, and it's something we need to talk about and do about. But we are still, I think, making up some ground on how do we think about mental health as we age? What are things that are important for meaningful life? How do we think about quality of life? How are we just like structuring moving into adulthood, right? Like, and we're I think pretty behind on that. I'm going to clarify one thing because of Ryan's comment. So when I say doing drugs, what I'm talking about are the drugs prescribed to you. And I have met a lot of men who have a lot of drugs prescribed to them that we use as coping mechanisms, and we actually don't totally discriminate when we're anxious versus when we're in pain, because they feel very similar. And then we can find ourselves in these really bad, these loops of pain, of comfort chasing with medicines, because like we're actually experiencing distress that we need to change our thought behavioral patterns with, and meds won't necessarily always address. And so we can find ourselves misusing prescribed medications simply because we are attributing our experiences of discomfort and aversiveness and other things to something that it's not actually.
And to feed into that again, just like the inability to actually follow through with any suicidal thoughts you might have. You know, a comment was made in here, even if you wanted to do drugs or have a drink to kind of take the edge off, you gotta have somebody else to help you. I mean, it's a whole nother ball game to try to manage and to cope, right?
Yeah.
And then another comment in here is, I always try. Oh, sure.
Well, there's a way. And so just because somebody it's hard to move doesn't mean people don't have. I have heard some. I would have never freaking thought of that. But if you're hanging out, depressed, wanting to kill yourself, and all you're doing is sitting there thinking about it all day, you're going to think of some things. I'll tell you that. And this is why we ask about suicide. We ask everybody, because what people are worried about is if I'm asking about suicide is going to make my kid think about suicide. No, it's like sex. You're thinking about it whether or not someone brings it up or not. Okay, so the only way that we can be helpful is by asking. So the other thing we have to do is check in with each other and ask, because it's that's the only way to know. And that is like one of the best things you can do to be helpful to people is ask them, because it's one of those things. If people are thinking about it, you're not going to put the thought in their head.
Just to wrap up this section, one of the comments that on Facebook is just bringing up the struggles that the parents have too. And again, another conversation, but one mom mentioned that her sons are so strong, and it's her that's really struggling with the depression and anxiety. She's not suicidal, but just giving a nod to the parents out there who are struggling. I have two. It's a community-wide thing, Natalie. And then if you think about, you know, it's not just our individuals with Duchenne, it's their support system is struggling with it too, right? It's like this crazy loop. Let's see. Yeah, and there's a 988 site. Let's see, Natalie, can you talk about that briefly, and we can talk about it again at the end?
Yeah, 988lifeline.org.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, the National Suicide Hotline also has some really robust services, and they have a call line as well as a text line, in case you like prefer to use eye gaze or something like that. Most every local county and state has their own suicide hotlines as well. And so I would, get those numbers. And if you're somebody that struggles, like they're available 24/7. And I know people that call them and like talk through stuff at 2 a.m. and that in and of itself can be helpful, right?
Because again, man, even if you wanted to go talk to somebody in private and you're an adult with Duchenne, you've got to get somebody else's help in order to go do that, right? You've got to bear yourself to another person. It's just, gosh, there's so many levels of difficulty in here. And one last contribution here from Matthew before we move on to kind of a subject with this. Matthew has shared that God has helped him get through his thoughts because he knows God is with him. And I'm so happy and excited that you found something to anchor you and support you. And I'd like to explore other ideas too, because not everybody has that intense level of faith. So I think that's fantastic, Matthew. I'm glad you have that. Ryan says his faith has helped get him through.
Also, I say it all the time, hope and purpose. So if you don't believe in a higher power, or hope for something and try to find some purpose, but maybe sometimes that's what you might need help with.
I think now is a good time to switch over into the adolescence period, and DJ is going to take over with the questions here. But Natalie, what we want to do is focus on kind of that period in life where an increased amount of suicidal ideation is just common for everybody. There's so much craziness going on in the brain during those adolescent years that, you know, just the brain's not quite developed enough to come up with a more sophisticated answer than, oh, I'm just going to kill myself and that'll take care of all my problems. So I'm excited to hear you and DJ chat about this. Let's see. DJ, are you all ready to go? All right. Whenever you're ready, DJ, go ahead and start your questions.
I do have a question for Dr. Truba. Could you talk a bit about the time period when most are more susceptible to depression and suicidal ideation?
Like in general? Just people in general, right, Beach? Okay, yeah, I think that's what you're, yeah, okay. Anybody can be susceptible to suicide. It tends to pick up more in the pre-adolescent to adolescent years when humans are developing a sense of self separate from their family. Their things become much more important externally, like friends, they're standing in social circles, these things. And then they have this, like, so you start to have this like burgeoning sort of sense of autonomy and independence and you know, desire to be your own thing, right? And so you tend to be impulsive and kind of quick, right? But you lack all of the brain parts needed to actually plan and think through the future and try to prevent, you know, big missteps. And so adolescence, that early through period into like the early 20s tends to be a pretty high risk period. And then after that, it's really anytime there's a significant life sort of impact, right? And if you've had those pre-vulnerabilities, then your risk is a lot higher. So if in adolescence, right, you were somebody that experienced a lot of suicidality and you had suicide attempts, if you have big events that are really negative occur later on, you'd be much more vulnerable for those things kind of reoccurring. And so adolescence is probably when I would say pre-adolescence, adolescence, when it picks up the most for any human.
As a follow-up, Natalie, could you speak on the extra X challenges during adolescence, the rescaffolding that takes place and how that may add to the struggles of Duchenne and suicide?
Oh, DH, good question. Okay, so during adolescence in general, in neurotypically developing brains, all brains, hormones are a hell of a drug. And as the brain as puberty starts, the brain actually does some rescaffolding in the frontal lobe and sort of how the brain kind of functions a bit. In the DMD population or dystrophinopathies kind of in general, there does seem to be some things that happen in puberty, and we're not really sure how consistent they are. If there's maybe some different processes that impact sort of how that process occurs for adolescents with DMD. The reasons for this is important is that during that time frame, right, there's a reason why adolescents that going through puberty tend to be very like kind of angsty, and they're like, they really misperceive, you know, how the social situation, like my parents are yelling at me and their parents were like not yelling at them, right? Or you're like, I know they're talking about me and like they're not talking about you, right? Have you guys ever had that experience kind of in adolescence where you're just, you know, you're just not reading the social situation right, and then you grow up and you're like, oh, I can't believe I thought everyone was talking about me all the time. They probably weren't even thinking about me. That's really that happens huge in adolescence for like anybody. Well, when you have DMD, your brain is already really susceptible to that off the bat, right? Of misperceiving stimulus as neutral, that's neutral or positive, is negative or threatening. Right. So then if that gets even worse, or if there's something that happens that's different there, wonky there, that's going to impact, you know, how puberty is manifesting or sort of evolving. And so I think there's a lot we have to learn about puberty in the DMD population. One, because we do have some information or data that suggests that like there may be something unique or something that is impacted in that natural sort of how the brain evolves during puberty for anybody that is a little different in the DMD population. If that helps us better understand like maybe how to help from a learning standpoint in that time frame to help people get through that could be huge, right? Especially if we can help from an identity formation. How do we help to have that separation and independent autonomous needed to actually separate and see yourself as other from your family but still connected? Get sort of that other support from social peers that is really needed to kind of become your own person, right? Then and have your own thoughts and kind of do the world in your own way. I think could be really important for like how do we help people be more independent.
Another question I have, Natalie, is how not having a set routine can play into the reasons why many of us really struggle to find our way and to avoid the hopeless feelings and thoughts.
DJ, that's a really good question. Set routines are amazing, okay, until they're not. So we're gonna get there. But a routine is huge because routine gives you predictability, it gives you consistency, it tells your brain what's coming next. And that in of itself, like if you're working a routine, you're doing stuff, you're like kind of going through it, like helps you feel productive, right? So if you sit around and you do nothing all day, that doesn't feel as good as sitting and you're like, I did this and then I did this and I did this and this and this and this could be like, I got out of bed, I went, got my chair, I went downstairs, I did this in this setting, then I went to this room and I did this, because it helps us to move, right, and have different, but it also like tells your brain like, this is a task and I did it, and this is a task and I did it, right? And that sense of achievement, right, or like completion is actually really important to human functioning in general. Where that becomes a problem though is if you have a routine or a habit and it's not helpful, right? Like it's maybe a bad routine, maybe like I'm going to use an easy one. So like you get home from work and you drink a bunch of alcohol because that is your routine. That can be really harmful and then really hard to actually stop, right? Because now it's like, well, this is what I always do. And it's like hard for me to stop doing this. And so routines are really helpful, and unless they're not helpful, and then it can be hard to get out of that routine. So we want to make sure we develop healthy routines. So routines that are focused on like kind of breaking up the day, but like things to do. So like we can't just play video games all day, because you're eventually, if you do that, you're going to notice like I actually don't feel as good if I just play video games all day. Like I need other things to like stimulate me and that make me feel good, even if that's like I went down to the kitchen and I ate a meal and then we did this and we did this. But having a routine that actually breaks your day up and it helps you kind of recognize like all that you're doing and achieving can be really, really important for your brain. But you just want to set that up in a way that's healthy.
My next question that I have, Dr. Truba, is one that I have struggled with at times during my own experiences with suicidal ideation, and that is, how not having the ability to actually control one's own life plays into the feeling of hopelessness.
Yeah, and what a unique experience to have. Very few people are going to be able to resonate with that in a way that like feels genuine. And it's a certain type of way of feeling alone, like when you're surrounded by people that love you and care about you, right? And they still don't necessarily get it, and they don't feel it. And so you still feel alone, even though you're supported in your own people. And that can actually make you feel worse. It can make you feel worse to kind of be in that situation, because then you're kind of like feel super alone, right? Like nobody gets it. I'm like totally alone. And kind of, I think the hard part is that you're not wrong, right? Like, I wish that I could say like, well, that's not true, and we just need to like make you not believe that. But it is kind of true, right? Like you do need full dependent help to do a lot of things, and you don't have control over those aspects of your life. You should have control over how that looks and how people help you and all the ways that you live life. And so that actually shouldn't be true. But what we know is that at the end of the day, there are times like people that even love you and are well-meaning are going to do things that maybe you don't want them or how you want them, because like they want to get it done quick or they need to get it done fast. And, even those little things like that adds up, right? Because like if able to do it yourself, like you wouldn't even have to be in that situation, right? And it's one of those things like you learn to sit with. I have a lot of men tell me like you just learn to sit with it and accept it because it's going to happen and it just sucks, and you just are like if you stay angry at it, it makes it worse, right? But it's like such a special type of hell to just like want to exercise control and exercise or your own life as a fully autonomous human, and like you, because of other people, like can't do that. And because you're diseased, which you can't change. If you could change that, right, then you sit there and be like, if only if I didn't have DMD, if only I didn't have DMD. And you're not wrong, right? But if we live in that space where it's like we're focusing so much on like, if only I didn't have DMD, that doesn't change anything. And it just kind of reinforces like how shitty that is, right? And so sometimes it's like, okay, I have DMD, I can't do anything about it. That sucks. Like, what's next? Like, where can I then do X, Y, or Z? And like that doesn't necessarily feel better, but we sometimes just need to get unstuck.
My next question for this portion of tonight's show, Natalie, is to ask if you could share about the guilt and shame associated with those of us with Duchenne, when we are in the throes of mental crisis and just wanting it to end, when we have a life-limiting disease that we know takes the lives of so many.
DJ, you're asking hard questions today, my man. I'm going to tackle the shame one first. Shame typically stems from pride. And in the community, I think there's a big feeling, I think, on the part of y'all men of like the need to be strong. And I hear this a lot around like, well, like I need to be strong because I don't want to upset my mom or I don't want to upset my dad. And when I talk about these things, like I know they get upset. And so I just need to be strong and I just need to be okay. And like then they're okay and like everyone's okay. Like this is my burden and my cross to bear. This is what I can kind of observe for my family. So there's a pride, right? And that I do this for my family, right? Like I'm sitting with this, I'm suffering so they don't have to. And if you don't do that, then you feel shame, right? Because now I'm weak and, you know, I'm not doing X, Y, Z. I have this expectation for myself and I'm not doing that thing. So shame is hard because shame is an emotion that stems from sort of a way that we want to present or see ourselves. It's not always necessarily healthy anyway, right? Nobody is strong all the time. And, you know, what I tell people is when you're presenting as strong and you're not, that's not being strong, that's just lying, right? Like true strength is when you can say, I'm actually not okay right now and I'm still going to do this today and this today, and I'm working on this and I know that I'll get through this, and this is a difficult moment or a difficult day or a difficult period of my life time. But I'm going to do these things to get through it and to try to do whatever I can to help myself make it through the other side. And so sometimes it's helping think through, what do we mean when we say strength, or what do we mean when we say pride, or what do we mean when we say shame? The grief piece is a little harder because I think there's a lot of reasons why people carry guilt, especially when it comes to mental health. I've heard everything ranging from I have so much need and I have all these physical needs and my parents do all these things for me, and then I don't want to add to that. And if I have mental health issues, then that's another thing that they need to worry about and they need to address, and they need to take me to visits. Okay. Like, I just want to be like, okay. So they just can they just do the DMD stuff and we don't have to worry about other stuff. Right. I think there's other guilt that stems from like, I worry about how I'm impacting my parents' health, and like they are getting older and they have to like do these things for me, and like I think that's hurting them, and I worry about like how they're aging and like who's going to take care of them. Like I want to take care of them, I'm supposed to be taking care of them, and they're taking care of me. Like that's another place guilt comes from. There's another place that guilt comes from of like I have mental issues, and then when I bring it up, it's like I feel like it's a burden to my parents because now they have to take me to the hospital, or they have to watch me or make sure I'm safe, or whatever it might be. I mean, the guilt piece is hard because it kind of is very individual around like, what is it about your mental health experiences, the people that are there to support you, your access to care, what that looks like, that I think contributes to like where people feel and carry guilt.
Oh, Natalie, you've just like blown my mind to make me realize things. Talking about shame and guilt. I can remember for so long I'd have people at church or wherever come up to me and say, "Oh, you're so strong." They would say that. Well, I know that I have this problem, but I know Ryan can handle it. If Ryan can't, he's never sad that I'm always good. And that would just put so much pressure on me to feel like I can't ever show I have a problem. I can't ever show that there's something wrong. And finally, at one point, not just a few years ago, really, I realized that by telling people, "Hey, I got problems sometimes. I'm not always, I have weakness," that actually helped them more than it also helped me to be able to admit that. And I didn't have anybody say, "Oh, well, never mind. I was wrong. You're
I
not
do
strong."
have another question for.
Thanks for sharing that, Ryan. I think that's important. Lay it on me, DJ.
But DJ already did his last one. Let's see. Yeah, I believe that was a mistake.
So like, I think that what you just said, Ryan, is really important because I think sometimes the ways that we as like non-affected people kind of try to promote or like, give accolades or kind of say like, you guys are dealing with like just stuff that like most people, like when they think about being in your shoes are like what people are telling in that moment is like, I don't know how you do what you do because like, I don't know if I would be able to tolerate that and cut that out. Right. It's more of a reflection of our own weaknesses as humans, right? Like that seems so scary that like you must be so strong and tough, right? And I think a lot of you, when we talk, you would say like, I don't really have a choice with my life. I'm just alive, like doing what I can do. Like I'm not strong or I'm not trying. It's just like I just have this disease, right? I'm not, going on my way to be like, yeah, I'm like way tougher than you and I'm tougher than you, right? It's just like I never thought I could be different. Like I'm just going to school, I'm just doing my life, right? Like anybody. And so I think people put that on you. I think that's a good way to say that. Like people put that pressure on you, right? Of this is like the expectation is that you need to be okay, or that like the expectation is you're okay because you have all of this and like look how well you're doing. Well, and you just probably would be like, well, yeah, if you had, dystropathy, you'd probably be doing the same thing because like what other choice do you have but to like do the things, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and we all have to judge on our experiences, but I know in my dissertation dealt with mothers. You talk to a lot of women, people say, "Oh wow, you're so amazing." You're a lot of mothers, they understand that pressure from. So I try to be more careful with talking to mothers too. That there's a lot of amazing people out there, but we're all dealing with our challenges.
Right. I think that's one really important message is like, what are you doing? Like, you seem super happy today. Like, like you got a lot you're dealing with. Like, that's awesome. Like, what are you doing that's working? Right. You might be like, I'm just faking it till I make it because I'm actually horrible today. And you'd be like, people will be like, oh, cool. Like that. Cause sometimes that's a strategy, right? Like, you're just like, I feel like doing none of the things I want to give up. So I'm going to go out of my house and make myself do X, Y, and Z. Right. And so
Right.
like you can present any type of way. Like, that's the nice thing about being a human is that with so much communication being nonverbal, we can lie and most animals can't, right? Like most animals, they can tell in their ears, you can tell in their face, you can tell in their skin and their hair, like how they're feeling. And humans, like we could be feeling one way and be like presenting out here like totally different, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that like these are important to kind of be like and I don't need to be okay to like function as an adult and go to school and be a kind human and try to have a job and do my cares, right? Like you can do both, like not be okay and still like live life, right? Because then you will be okay. It's ebb and flow. Like no one's ever okay all the time. And if that's the goal, no one's going to be happy, right? And then if we were, we wouldn't even know what really happiness was because we never felt something different. Like I can't imagine a world full of guilt and lacking guilt and no shame and no pain and suffering. Like that would be terrifying. People would be like over here doing whatever because nobody would feel bad and nobody would like worry about people, right? Like these emotions are important. We just don't want to get stuck in them.
Yeah, every emotion's good. If we didn't have those negative, bad emotions, our good emotions wouldn't mean much.
Correct. Right. So it's like your good days, your bad days, and one thing I wish that people would do is stop, like, I love that term in the disability community, or disability rights or advocacy around like disability porn, where people are like celebrating like disabilities in the sense of like, you're so strong, you're great, I couldn't do it if I was in that. And it's like, you're actually like, what we're saying is like, we're pretty weak, right? And if we had like something that was hard, that made it hard, or that to move, like we'd just be like, well, throw in the towel. And how often do you guys want to do that? Probably just as much as anyone else would in your situation, but you don't, and you work through it. And like, that's the measure of strength, and that's the measure of toughness. And often you could say like, well, I don't have a choice, Natalie. There's always choices. There's always choices, right? And so like, even getting out there and telling people like, you know what, I'm not okay, and I'm okay not being okay. Like that's huge. Like that would be better for most people to hear than people being like, oh, I'm great, and like I'm not even bothered by the fact that, you know, I couldn't like scratch my nose for an hour and a half today. That's totally fine.
Yeah, I know, speaking for myself, and I assume everybody else, there's not one of us where if we're showing, okay, this needle, this injection has a cure for muscular dystrophy. There's not one of us is going to say, nah, I'm going to keep it. No, we're going to get rid of this garbage as soon as we can. But until then, we're just going to do our best. But this is kind of going into the next part, is like how to help ourselves having these thoughts and feelings. I'd like to kind of have let's talk about that. But when we're having these thoughts, having these feelings, Natalie, what do you like? What's your general advice on that?
I think it depends how severe they are. I think if you can get linked with a mental health professional that can help you think about like all the messages you've got about having a chronic illness, all the things people have told you about what it means to be strong, all the things that we hear about what good mental health and what people need, and that can help you like work through values and work through what it means to live a good quality life, and what are the things that you need to feel happy, and then how do you do that, right? Like, and that can look different for everybody, I think, is important. I think if at any time that you feel like you can't guarantee that you keep yourself safe, or if you're worried about somebody being able to keep themselves safe, right? Like, then you need a higher level of care, and you go to the emergency room and you get looked at, and you say, I'm really worried that I can't keep myself safe, right? Because we have mechanisms in place to force people, like we can legally keep you safe for a few days to try to get you to a better place, right, where you're more stable. Because the concept of suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem, not temporary problem in the sense of Duchenne. Duchenne is not a temporary problem, but our experiences of suffering related to our experience as being a human is temporary. It might be a long temporary, right? But we can work through that. We can get to a place if we do the work, if we want help, if we're willing to try, that suffering is lessened, or it's less intense, or it's less prolonged, or it's less frequent, right? Will suffering happen? Yes. Do we want it to be constant, or something that we have to, that brings us down and that we can't get out of? No. We want to have moments of suffering that we get through, and then we can move on until the next moment of suffering, and then we work through that, and then we move on, right? And that might happen daily for some people, right? But we don't want it constant, daily, 24/7, 365.
And one thing I think is important about, you talked about having a routine, the schedules that you say, okay, I accomplished this, I accomplished this. When hard times come, they'll come to each of us at different times. My parents passed away. My mom passed away in July 2021, and my dad in October 2021. And I'd had times where I got down. It was challenging, but that was really my limit, which it's a pretty rough thing. Just recently, though, I realized I never really fully coped with that. What I did is I just kind of transferred it over to somebody else, a caregiver, and they moved on, and it all hit me again. So the important thing to do to help get over these thoughts and feelings is, one, to try to go back and think, okay, what have I overcome before? But also, we've got to accept it and talk to somebody and make sure that we're not just transferring these feelings to something else to help cope with it. Because, if we're just playing video games, like you said, eventually we're going to be like, I can't do video games anymore.
Yeah, and I think it's how do we keep our minds enriched, right? Like, what are things we do during the day that give us enrichment, right? Like we explore museums, or we do X or Y or Z, and then maybe we read a book or listen to an audiobook, or maybe we sit outside and just like experience this. Like, there's other ways of kind of helping yourself cope that aren't just formal therapy, right? And sometimes that is kind of like exactly what you're saying, and other times it's like, I'm gonna play video games for an hour. Then I'm gonna go do this other thing for a bit, and I need to like keep my mind busy, and I need to volunteer, because then I feel good, and I want to like, put together something nice for Mrs. Smith next door who's 90, right? Or whatever it is. Like, there's things that you have that you can do that other people can't do, right? And there's ways to bring that into a space that you're like, I did something today, right? And it doesn't have to be equivalent to the other people in your life. Like, maybe you didn't work 40 hours a week like your dad or your mom, but you did other things that are equally as important and give meaning, and like, be kind to yourself. Like, that's the other thing I think is important, is that like, can't compare yourself to other people, and being kind to yourself around like what you accomplish and what you achieve. Like, sometimes getting out of bed and just get out of bed and get into your chair, and the fact that you like let someone do that can be the biggest thing if you're in a really bad place and you just want to lay in bed all day. That can be huge, right? And so like, honor that, be like, you know what, I didn't have to do that, and I chose to do that even though I didn't want to. That's big. That's a big deal. It's a first step to the next thing you can do today.
Yeah, maybe we can't do things for others the standard way, or like it really bothers me that I can't go clean somebody's yard. I'd like to do that. But there are other ways that we can serve. Talking about guilt, I always felt like, if we were going to compare, that my mom and my dad did so much for me that, there's no way that I could ever contribute like they did. But I found a way that I could. I managed in-home caregiving. I made sure people were here, that they were able to, my mom was able to pass away at her home. And I kept my dad here, then took care of him as long as I could. So maybe I wasn't able to do the physical care, but there was a way I could provide care in another way.
Exactly.
Questions for you, Natalie, and we are actually wrapping this up, believe it or not. And first, I'd like to say a great big thank you to both DJ, Matthew, and Ryan for, again, for sharing all of these personal experiences, and just helping us raise awareness in our community about these struggles. It's not fair that our individuals with Duchenne have to deal with normal life also, like parents passing away, or, financial problems, or, one of 1,000 things. It's just not fair. But I appreciate you guys talking about this, and letting us get these conversations started. So question, Natalie, if somebody is having thoughts about harming themselves, can we really rely on them to get help for themselves?
Sometimes there are a lot of people who feel very distressed by those thoughts, right? Because
Okay.
they have very strong thoughts and feelings about wanting to hurt themselves. They have conflicting about that. Like, I don't want to be here. I'm thinking about killing myself, but they don't want to. They know it's going to hurt so-and-so and so-and-so and this and this and this impacts. So I have all these reasons not to do it, but I still want to do it, right? And that's where a lot of people are, and a lot of people select help, right? Like, they go to therapy, they go to the hospital, they get themselves admitted. A lot of people don't actually want to die, right? They are so in such a hard place, and they're so suffering so much and so much pain, and they lack the infrastructure, supports, whatever it is that's needed to kind of navigate that they're not thinking the best, and they don't see another way out. But they're also like, our instinct to survive and like not die is always kind of still there, right? And when it's not, like, that's a really dangerous situation from a suicide standpoint, right? Like, there are people who are like dead set on themselves, and they don't have that. They were like, it's not the same, but that is less frequent than those people in the middle that actually do want to do something to help keep themselves safe. If you find yourself in a position where somebody is not able to commit to that, right? Most people say like, yeah, I want to keep myself safe. I'm having thoughts where I don't, but I'm actively fighting them because I know that this will pass. Like I know that in 2 days I'll feel better. And so I don't want to, right? So people find themselves there, but if not, that's why we have laws and other things that can kind of take people's choices and their rights away from them, essentially, to make sure that we can keep them alive during a period of acute emotional distress, which is why the hold for that, when we call sort of involuntary committing somebody, is 3 days, 72 hours. And that allows time to kind of help get them out of that acute state so that they can hopefully do other things to help keep themselves safe. And so, then it would be kind of either calling 911, calling a wellness check and having somebody look at them, getting them to the hospital to get evaluated, so that we're not making a decision in acute emotional stress now that maybe we'd make a different decision in 3, 4, 5 days if we had good supports and we could kind of get out of this acute period of whatever's causing us in this moment to like really amp up to the next stage of active suicidality.
So what kind of tips should extended family and friends look for, or cues in our population of men who want to not show anything because they don't want to be a burden on other people? What sort of things should we look for so that we can kind of stay in touch?
Oh, that is a hard one. I'm not 100% sure because the things we look for and generally are things that we would continue to look for, right? Like, do we see big changes in behavior, or do we see huge mood changes? Are we more tearful, or do we seem like we have less hope? Are we less motivated to do things, to take care of ourselves? The things that just go into sort of like, doing life. If those things start to, if you're caring for somebody and they're like, what, I don't want to get up, I don't want to get clean, I don't want to eat, I would be very worried about that, right? Like those are all things you need to do to live and be healthy. And so if we're stopping those things, with somebody that's depressed, they might, if they don't have Duchenne, they might sleep all day, they might not eat, they might stop going to work, they might do things, right, that get them in big trouble. That's going to look different than in the DMD community. I think this is why it's really important that we ask and we talk, like, how are you doing? Are you having thoughts about wanting to hurt yourself? Are you having thoughts about wanting to escape? Because otherwise, the people are very unlikely to bring it up because, again, I can't emphasize how many times I hear, like, I struggle with these things. I think about death. I think about how I want to die. I think about the impact on my parents. I think about all these things, but I would never tell them because then they would get upset and distressed. And I don't want them to worry about me, or like, I don't want them to worry that I'm worried. Like, I want them to be happy. And then the parents are like, I just don't know if they're thinking about these things. And I worry about it all the time, but I don't want to ask them because I don't. And it's like, wow, we're just having the same conversation, but you guys just aren't doing it together. So sometimes talking about that, bringing it to space, and like, everyone has the same worries, but then you can plan. And like, sometimes parents just being like, oh, dude, we have a whole plan for like taking care of us when we're older. They're like, oh, okay, well, I don't worry about that anymore. Like, so it's, or like, yeah, like you're suffering. Like I suffer too. Like I worry about you. I find myself in, this is what I do. Like, let's come up with a plan for when one of us is in a dark space. Like, what do we do, right, to get out of that? Because like, I care about you and I don't like want you sitting here suffering all day and nobody knows that, right? So I think asking and talking and checking in and making it normal, right, I think is the best thing we can do in this community, because if you're looking for those other cues, like they might either A, not exist, or be very hard to kind of ascertain given sort of how we have to live life and how that's structured.
Fantastic, thank you. I believe DJ has a question.
I do have another question for Natalie. Could you share with us on how to find a way to help those that are struggling with these feelings and thoughts?
Oh, I think we need more infrastructure for connection. And I think we need that in general as humans. But I think for this community, we really need that because we're doing all these things to help people live their best life as long as possible. But the infrastructure for like how to, like what's available to actually to do that, right? It's not just like good medical care, but then also, the other things that go into help making life feel good, right? So connection and opportunity to connect and or just like talk to people, like whether that's online or, in real life, I think is important, because if you're not talking to people, if you don't see people, like you wouldn't even know how to check in with them, right? Unless they are self-selecting into certain settings like this, right? And then if you're doing that, you're probably already at a little bit better place to kind of talk about these things, right? Because you're expressing interest, or at least you're receptive. You're like, hey, I know this is a thing. I think this is why it's so important to address mental health at clinic visits, at MDA visits, and neuromuscular visits, so that like we're having people that are bringing this up, because it's like to normalize and be like, oh, it's just a part of healthcare, right? Like, how is mental health not a part of healthcare? Of course it is, but it also models to parents, to caregivers, to aides, to whoever, that like it's just normal to talk about these things and ask about it and check in, right? And so sometimes getting that conversation started in the medical setting, like kind of normalizes it and like helps give a plan, like, well, how do we do this at home, right? Just like your parents didn't know how to like probably work a vent before you needed a vent, and now they're like, nah, we're freaking pros, right? Or like they didn't know how to use a feeding tube, or they didn't know how to catheter, they didn't know how to move you or transition you, and now they're like nurses essentially, probably, right? So like you learn, but we have to start somewhere. And so I think really it's like getting the word out, whether that's written or whatever, to just encourage people to, if they don't ask you about mental health at your MDA neuromuscular visit, like bring it up, be like, hey, can I talk about mental health? Like, I'm doing okay right now, but sometimes I struggle with this, right? Because that puts on your doctor's radars that like, oh, I should talk about this, I should ask about this, right? Because sometimes, neuromuscular docs love them, don't get me wrong, but they're like muscle, which they should be, that's their job, right? But as soon as they're like, oh yeah, that's a huge thing for you guys, they shift and they incorporate that into their practice sometimes, right? And so, sometimes like, bringing it up to be like, hey, do you guys have a social worker I can touch base with, or a psychologist? That can be helpful in clinic. I know it's not fair to put the burden or the onus on you. So we were working on that with clinics as well. Like, hey, you guys, we need to do better. These are standards. But I think connection and getting the community kind of involved with each other so that there's space to bring these kind of conversations up. I mean, I've been involved in a handful of these in the last little bit, and that's just recently, right? And so we're just starting to talk about this. And so I think the more people that we can get involved in talking, and even those ones that are like, I never have these issues, it's like, tell us about your life and what are you doing? Because that's amazing, right? Like all of it's helpful. Like even if you aren't somebody on the suffering side, right? Like you maybe have ways of doing things that are just helpful to hear. And so I think it's just really getting people together.
So Natalie, you shared an interesting statistic with me yesterday that I was hoping you would share with the community and talk a little bit more about it, particularly since this is a genetic disease and it can run through the entire family. So things that extended family needs to be aware of if there is a suicide in their family or suicidal ideation.
Yeah, so one of the big predictors for suicidal risk is completed as somebody who has killed themselves in the family, particularly an immediate family member. And so if there's a parent, sibling, somebody like that kills themselves, the child's risk of killing themselves is significantly higher. Like I think it's like 3 to 5 times as higher, something like that. And so in the community, if there is a suicide, even if it's not somebody with DMD, but a parent, a family member, grandparent, sibling, it's really important, I think, to assess the entire community, because suicide contagion is a real thing. But then also assess, the individuals in that family, and to keep that assessment going and to help them understand, like, this is something that may make you more vulnerable. It's something to be aware of, right? Like you have to know your predispositions to things, or things that, that maybe affect you. And there's a lot of modeling that goes on when people are chronically suicidal or choose to kill themselves or end their lives. And so there's a lot of learning. And so it's really important from a safety standpoint that if there is a completed suicide or somebody that kills themselves in your family or in a family that, regardless if they have DMD or not, that there's like good supports for that entire family, because that does have like long-term impact in the family unit and sort of how mental health is coped with and dealt with. And so it's one of those things when people tell us, oh yeah, like my parent killed themselves, we're like, oh, okay, we need to like further assess to make sure that you don't have more risk factors than the average bear, sort of.
Right, and this just occurred to me. I wonder if in the DMD population, since we clearly addressed that our individuals with Duchenne aren't always able to act upon their own wishes, even if it has to do with suicide. I'm wondering if there could be a higher propensity there simply because they didn't have the opportunity. Do you know what I mean? Like if they didn't have Duchenne, then it would have happened, and it can still affect the other family members, whether it's a little bit of a mental illness that's slightly off, or some sort of component with that, which to me just means you've got to talk about it more, unearth it, let everybody in the family know what's going on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we have seen suicide increase dramatically in the population over the last several 10, like several years. I think it used to be like the 8th or 9th leading cause of death, and then I think before COVID or during COVID it jumped up to 2nd or 3rd, or it's very high at this point for adults. Sorry, I'm not a suicide expert, so I can't remember the stats. It's been a while. But there's been a steady increase for suicide, particularly, I mean, in young adults, but then also men in general, men that are in their 40s, 50s, particularly. So suicide, I mean, even in children, there's been increased rate of suicide. That's just the normal population. People that are like, we could say physically fine. So suicide has gotten increased in that community where people have the opportunity to do all the things they want to do, and they don't have the stressors associated with dystrophin, having a dystrophinopathy brain, and they don't have the vulnerability factors associated with all of having the chronic illness. Why would we think that in this population they have been spared from the increased distress and stress that everyone else is experiencing, on top of having a life-limiting chronic condition that is very challenging, right? So my guess is that if we actually sampled the entire community in the United States, we would have very high rates of at least passive SI, where people are like, oh yeah, like at least, X amount of times a month or X amount of times a year, I have desires to like not be here, not have to deal with this anymore. I think that would be actually probably like we'd see more of that than less of that. I think the completions are left because it's really hard to kill yourself in this community. But again, where there's a will, there's a way. And also if someone's with you 24/7, I mean, that's one of the interventions we do to keep people from killing themselves, right? Put somebody with them 24/7. So some of those things are already in place, right? Where like, hard to get means, there's supervision a lot. So you really have to be, in it, like there's just a lot of stuff that goes into it. So do I think that it's like a less problem in this community? No. Do I think there's a lot of natural buffers in this community that make people feel like they can feel fine just because we're not talking about it? So we don't know about it because we're not asking about it, right? And then like everything's structured in a way that like it's really hard. So we're just like, yeah, people are doing great. And then I just don't. I would be super surprised if that was actually the case. Not to be a Debbie Downer, just to be realistic around like. I don't think if everyone in the population is doing less well, that the DMD community is like, and now I'm thriving. Like, I don't know if that's how that goes when, COVID has hit y'all especially hard, and like just being able to get out and do life I used to do.
And that's a fantastic point to bring up, that a lot of our individuals with Duchenne have these natural barriers to completing a suicide, just to drive home the fact that this is a very real concern. If the whole hour and a half prior to us didn't convince you, I saw somebody share on Facebook that there was an individual with Duchenne who committed suicide a couple of years ago, and just found a big old lake and just went on in. And so yeah, if people really want to, if there's a will, there's a way, and we just got to check in with everybody.
Yes, because what we want is we don't want the people that we care about to suffer unduly. You're gonna, like, suffering is part of life, right? But there's people that care, there's people that get it, there's people that want to help, right? Even though it might not feel like that all the time.
We did have a couple questions in the Facebook comments that were a little bit tangential, and I'll just have the people those were directed to look at the comments and have them address them directly. Natalie, man, just want to give you a big old hug. This is so crazy important, and you're so wonderful. I know, right? You're just so crazy generous with your time, and God, the level to which you get this, it's, who was it? Somebody was saying, are you reading my mind? Somebody in the chat here. It's just crazy. So grateful for your interest in our community and for your willingness to take time to chat with us and tell us what's going on in our brains. Just really grateful. So thank you 1,000 times over. And you usually do you're very generous. If anybody has any questions, comment me or message me, and I can pass the question on to you. I'm assuming that's still on the table.
Yeah, that's fine. And thank you for having me and letting me be a part of your guys' community. I know I'm outsider trying to be helpful from within, but because I get to hang out with people like you, all like DJ and Ryan and Matt and Lindy and so many other families, like, and you guys are very open. And I think the best thing that we could do is listen and kind of believe that like these things are happening. If you listen to enough stories, you're like, well, shoot, these are all super similar. And I think that's important because in a rare disease, when you're spread across all over, it's easy to be like, I don't see anyone else with DMD, like I'm super alone. And you are, but you're not, right? Because there's this whole community that like totally gets it, right? And then there's yahoos like me that are trying to get it, right? But like, it's different. And so I think it takes a village, and even, that doesn't stop just because you're 30.
I love that. That's so important. I believe
Can I say
DJ.
something?
Oh,
Can I say
sure.
one
Go
thing?
ahead, please.
Natalie, I'm taking a lot of, I don't know if I'm qualified to do this or not, but on behalf of the entire DMD community, we adopt you as like a sister. So thank you for what you did. So maybe a cousin, we'll see.
I'll take it. If I get demoted to cousinhood, I'll be like, oh, I'll still take it.
Fantastic. And on that note, my little one's coming in telling me it's time to go back to being mama. DJ, could you please take us away?
I guess it's time to wrap up this week's The Duchenne Live. We hope that everyone enjoyed tonight's show. We definitely enjoyed having Matthew and Dr. Truba join us tonight for a great conversation on mental health, depression, and suicidal ideation. Thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. See you all again next week for another The Duchenne Live. Have a great night.